saying things like she were being slam choked. Now, we didn't know what that was. It's something to do with you grab them around the neck and throw them onto bed or something. It's something you do if you were karate or something like that, but it's not sort of the thing you'd associate with a 10-month, 11-month-old.
In a world where children are meant to be cherished and protected, how could a little girl, loved by so many, fall through the cracks of a broken system? Star Hobson was just 16 months old, her bright eyes and infectious smile capable of lighting up every room she entered. But in September of 2020, her life was brutally taken in the very place she should have been safest, her own home. How did this happen? How did a young child, surrounded by family who loved her, end up in such a tragic situation? Star Hobson's life was supposed to be full of love and joy. Born on May 21st, 2019 in Cave, West Yorkshire, Star was described by those who knew her as cheerful and quick to smile. Her family adored her. Her mother, Frankie Smith, and her father, Jordan Hobson, did their best to care for their little girl, surrounded by loving relatives. From her earliest days, Star was the apple of everyone's eye. Family members would often capture moments of her swaying to music, clapping with joy, or toddling around in the arms of those who cared for her. The first months of her life were filled with warmth, laughter, and the kind of close-knit family support that every child deserves. But despite the apparent love surrounding her, something dark began to creep into Star's life. Star's mother, Frankie, was a teenager when she had Star. She was only 17 years old, struggling to balance the demands of motherhood with the realities of being so young. Frankie, described by family as socially immature with a cognitive ability that was below average, found herself heavily relying on her family to help her navigate the challenges of being a first-time mom. But even with her family's support, Frankie's life was about to change in a way no one could predict. In late 2019, Frankie met Savannah Brockhill, a 25-year-old woman with a controlling and aggressive personality. Their relationship progressed quickly, and soon Savannah became a dominant force in Frankie's life. Despite the warnings from family and friends, Frankie and Savannah's bond grew tighter, and Frankie began to rely on her new partner for everything, leaving little room for the support and care of Star. What seemed like a whirlwind romance soon turned into something far more dangerous. Savannah, who had a history of controlling behavior, began to isolate Frankie from the very people who had been her support system. Savannah didn't just want control over Frankie's life, she wanted control over Star's life too. Family members began noticing troubling signs, including bruises on Star's tiny body and behavioral changes that spoke volumes about the abuse she was enduring behind closed doors. Yet despite the visible signs of harm, the system designed to protect children failed Star at every turn. Multiple warnings were raised by family members and friends who noticed the distressing changes in Star's condition. They called social services, sending photos and making multiple attempts to intervene, but each time the case was closed. Social workers visited the home, but their assessments were shallow, and the red flags raised by Star's family were ignored. The system, it seemed, was not equipped to respond to the rising danger within that home. On September 22, 2020, Star's life came to a tragic end. The circumstances surrounding her death were shocking and horrific. Savannah Brockhill, in a fit of rage, attacked Star with such brutal force that her internal organs were torn. The force required to cause the injuries was likened to the impact of a road traffic collision. In the critical minutes following the attack, instead of seeking immediate medical help, Frankie searched online for answers. But it was too late. The delay in calling 999 cost Star her life. By the time paramedics arrived, it was already too late to save her. How could this happen? How could a child, surrounded by family who loved her, fall through the cracks of a system that should have protected her? Star's story is one of devastating failure. Failure of the system, failure of the people who were supposed to protect her, and failure of the very system that was meant to ensure her safety. Every like, every subscription, and every share of this video is a chance for another child to live a life free of abuse. Share this story, and let's fight to protect children everywhere. Star's tragic death must not be forgotten, and we can ensure that her story sparks change. Please take a moment to leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from and what time it is in your location. Your support is vital, and your voice can help make a difference. Let's spread awareness, bring attention to the failures of the system, and work toward a future where no child is left behind. Let's honor Star's memory by making sure no other child suffers the same fate. Share this video, raise awareness, and together, let's fight to protect our children.
It was heartbreaking the last time I saw her. It was horrible.
Describe how she was.
Just distant. She was very clingy, but not like a good clingy. It was very much like she wouldn't let go of me. And just, it wasn't, like, I've never seen a depressed baby, but that is what it was like. It was, I think, that day I saw her, I think will scar me for the rest of my life.
Star Hobson's life began with the kind of warmth and love that every child deserves. Born on May 21, 2019 in Keighley, West Yorkshire, Star was a 16-month-old baby girl whose personality shone brighter than the sun. From the earliest moments of her life, she became the center of attention in her family, a light in every room she entered. Star was described by her family as an exuberant, joyful toddler who loved to play, sing, and dance to the rhythm of music. She was responsive, engaged, and always quick to flash a smile at anyone who would give her attention. The most precious moments were captured on video by her family, showcasing a child who loved to sway to her favorite tunes, clap along to songs, and light up when anyone entered the room. These simple, innocent acts, often forgotten in the chaos of daily life, became the cherished memories of her brief existence. Star's early life appeared to be one of security and affection. She was not just the daughter of her parents, but the beloved granddaughter and great-granddaughter of a tight-knit family that adored her. Star was surrounded by relatives who took pride in every little milestone, her first steps, her first words, and the joy she brought into their lives. Star was everything that any young child should be: loved, cared for, and safe in the arms of her family. Despite her young age, Star's personality was clear. She was a happy, curious child. Her natural inquisitiveness meant she was always exploring her world with a sense of wonder. And in her short life, she had already created bonds with her family members. Bonds that were formed not just through the blood shared between them, but through shared experiences and laughter. The photos taken during those first months of life show a little girl full of potential, with bright eyes and a joyful laugh that made everyone around her smile. Star was everything a parent could hope for in a child. But behind those innocent eyes and bright smiles, trouble was quietly creeping into Star's world, unnoticed by many, but felt deeply by those who were close to her. Star's mother, Frankie Smith, was just 17 years old when she gave birth to Star. Like many young mothers, Frankie was still navigating the realities of adulthood while adjusting to the life-changing responsibility of parenthood. Frankie's youth and inexperience were apparent, and her cognitive ability was tested and found to be below average, placing her in a category of social immaturity that meant she required more guidance than most. However, what Frankie lacked in experience, she made up for with her unwavering love for her daughter. From the moment Star was born, Frankie devoted herself to being the best mother she could be. She was deeply connected to her daughter, and Star was the center of her world. Frankie often turned to her family for help, particularly her mother, Yvonne, and her grandparents, Anita and David Smith, who played a crucial role in Star's early years. Yvonne, Frankie's mother, was incredibly supportive, offering guidance on the practicalities of caring for a newborn and providing the emotional backing that a young mother so desperately needs. The strong, dependable presence of Yvonne in Frankie's life gave her a sense of security. She knew she could rely on her mother for help when things became overwhelming. This family connection was essential as it provided not only practical help, but also emotional support during what was likely a challenging time for the young mother. Star's great-grandparents, Anita and David Smith, were also constant figures in her life. Their involvement went beyond the occasional visit. They were actively involved in Star's care. Whether it was taking care of her for a few hours to give Frankie a break, or simply offering their hands for support, Anita and David became the pillars of Star's early life. They were present during the tender moments, offering their love and care for the little girl who was quickly becoming the heart of their family. These were the people who watched Star grow, who celebrated her milestones, and who, in their hearts, thought that nothing could possibly go wrong in the life of such a loved child. Together, this core family unit, Frankie, Yvonne, Anita, and David, formed a close-knit group that surrounded Star with love and attention. For many, family is everything, and in Star's early days, it appeared that she was blessed to be in a supportive, caring environment. But, as we now know, the challenges that lay ahead would test the strength of these familial bonds in ways no one could have ever predicted. Star's father, Jordan Hobson, was a young student when Star was born. Although he and Frankie separated by late 2019, Jordan remained involved in Star's life. Even after their relationship ended, he continued to play a role in his daughter's life, maintaining contact with her through family members. While Jordan wasn't a full-time presence in Star's life, he was still an important figure who cared about his daughter's well-being. Like the rest of Star's family, Jordan was concerned about her safety, though his role in her daily life was more distant compared to Frankie's family members. As the family dynamic shifted, the involvement of Frankie's mother, Yvonne, and the extended family remained pivotal in Star's care. Yvonne continued to step in to help Frankie with the day-to-day aspects of motherhood, giving her support when needed, and ensuring that Star had a consistent support network around her. It was clear that Star was loved and adored by her maternal family, particularly her grandparents and great-grandparents, who offered the stability that any young child needs to thrive. Yet, as the family structure seemed to remain grounded in love and care, a new influence entered Frankie's life that would change everything. In December 2019, Frankie met Savannah Brockhill at a pub in Bradford. Savannah, 8 years older than Frankie, was a former amateur boxer and worked as door security at the pub. Initially, their relationship seemed exciting, full of passion and newness. But quickly, Savannah became the dominant figure in Frankie's life. She moved in with Frankie and Star, and the dynamics within their small family began to shift dramatically. What was once a calm, supportive environment quickly became a place filled with tension, control, and jealousy. As Savannah's influence over Frankie grew, so did her control over Star's life. Family members noticed the change in Frankie's behavior. She seemed more distant, less engaged with her daughter, and increasingly isolated from those who had once been her support system. Family members grew concerned, particularly as they saw the once vibrant Star becoming withdrawn and distressed. Star Hobson was born into a family that loved her deeply, but as her mother's relationship with Savannah Brockhill intensified, the support and care she once had began to fade. Despite the love she received from her family, the growing control of Savannah and the systemic failures that would follow left Star vulnerable in ways no one could have imagined. As the family dynamic shifted, the true tragedy of Star's life began to unfold, one that would shake the very foundation of those who had loved her. In late 2019, just over 6 months after Star Hobson was born, a new figure entered the life of Star and her mother, Frankie Smith. That figure was Savannah Brockhill. 8 years older than Frankie, Savannah worked as a door security guard at a local pub in Bradford and quickly became a prominent part of Frankie's life. To outsiders, their relationship may have seemed intense, but filled with the kind of passion often seen in new romances. However, beneath the surface, things were not as they appeared. Savannah's presence soon overshadowed everything else in Frankie's life, including her relationship with Star. Savannah wasn't just a casual partner in Frankie's life. She became a central figure, a dominant presence who quickly manipulated the dynamic of their small family. While Frankie's relationship with her mother, Yvonne, and other family members was built on mutual support and love, Savannah quickly began to take control. Her personality, marked by intensity and possessiveness, shifted the balance in the home. She didn't just want to be a part of Frankie's life. She demanded to be the center of it. This demand for control soon extended to Star as well. At first, Savannah's role in Star's life was that of a partner to Frankie, someone who was present but didn't immediately intrude on Star's care. But as time went on, she began asserting herself more and more, establishing a level of dominance that would go on to create a toxic environment for both Frankie and Star. Savannah, with her overbearing attitude, was never content simply being in the background. Instead, she inserted herself into every aspect of Star's life, making her presence impossible to ignore. Her role as a stepmother figure in Star's life, however, was anything but benign. Rather than supporting Frankie and becoming a positive influence for Star, Savannah's behavior quickly escalated, and the home that had once been full of love became a place marked by control, manipulation, and intimidation. The love that Star had once known was replaced by fear, a fear rooted in the actions of the woman who had been allowed into their lives. From the very beginning, Savannah exhibited controlling behaviors that would soon spiral into aggression and abuse. Her personality was intense, sometimes described as domineering and possessive, traits that quickly revealed themselves in the early stages of her relationship with Frankie. Savannah's jealousy wasn't just a passing concern, it was a constant presence, and it intensified over time. She wanted Frankie all to herself, and she wasn't shy about expressing her control over her partner. Savannah's jealousy and possessiveness weren't just directed at Frankie's romantic relationships, but also at her friendships and connections with family. She monitored who Frankie spoke to, who visited the home, and even what kind of relationships Frankie maintained outside of their tumultuous partnership. It didn't take long before Savannah's controlling tendencies started to extend beyond Frankie to include Star. Savannah didn't just view Star as Frankie's daughter, she saw her as another entity she could control. Initially, it may have seemed that Savannah's presence was simply that of a partner helping to care for the child. But as time passed, it became clear that Savannah was slowly inserting herself into every aspect of Star's life. What began as a seemingly supportive relationship soon turned into a power struggle between the two women, with Frankie caught in the middle. Her young, vulnerable state made her highly susceptible to Savannah's manipulations, and her dependence on her partner only grew as the relationship intensified. Savannah's influence was not subtle. She not only demanded complete control over Frankie, but also began dictating how Star should be cared for, disregarding the opinions and involvement of Star's extended family. Frankie's connection to her mother, Yvonne, and other relatives began to fade as Savannah positioned herself as the primary figure in the household. This wasn't just a shift in household dynamics, it was a calculated effort to isolate Frankie from the people who had supported her through motherhood. Family members who once played an active role in Star's care found themselves pushed to the periphery, with Frankie spending less and less time with them and more time catering to Savannah's whims. What made Savannah's behavior even more toxic was the way she used intimidation to maintain control. Her jealousy and possessiveness were not simply emotional outbursts, they were threats, sometimes veiled, sometimes direct. Savannah made it clear that anyone who challenged her control over Frankie and Star would face the consequences. She made numerous threats, not only in private, but also in public posts and messages, warning anyone who got too close to Frankie that they would be met with hostility. This volatile mix of jealousy, possessiveness, and aggression created an environment of fear in the home. Fear for Star, who was too young to understand the complexities of adult relationships but felt the tension nonetheless, and fear for Frankie, who was left emotionally dependent on a partner who had no qualms about using power and intimidation. Frankie, already vulnerable due to her age and lack of experience, was ill-equipped to deal with the dynamics of a relationship marked by control and manipulation. She had become isolated from her support system, and her own emotional instability made it difficult for her to see the full extent of the harm Savannah was causing. The emotional weight of their relationship pushed Frankie into a place where her ability to protect her daughter was compromised. It was not just a toxic romantic relationship, it was a partnership in which Star, a child who should have been safe, was subjected to an environment of constant stress and fear. The relationship between Frankie and Savannah was not only unhealthy for them, it was downright dangerous for Star. As Savannah took control, the toxic dynamics of the relationship began to manifest in the most harmful ways. For all the love Star had received from her extended family, she was now facing a reality where her mother, for all her good intentions, had allowed a woman with a controlling and violent streak to dominate their lives. Savannah's controlling behavior was not a temporary phase. It was a gradual and consistent process of manipulation, aggression, and isolation. She didn't just isolate Frankie from her family. She isolated Star from the very people who had once cared for her, and in doing so, she created a dangerous atmosphere where abuse could thrive, unchecked and unchallenged. In the following months, as Savannah's behavior became more volatile, the situation at home deteriorated. Star, who was once a happy and active toddler, was now living in a home marked by fear and tension. The love that had once enveloped her seemed like a distant memory. Instead, Star was left to navigate a world where control and aggression were the only constants, and where her mother, unable to protect her, became complicit in the toxic environment created by Savannah Brockhill. It was a tragic and heartbreaking shift from the loving environment Star had once known, a shift that would eventually lead to unimaginable consequences.
As the months passed in 2020, the early signs of abuse became more apparent. What once seemed like small red flags quickly grew into undeniable concerns. Star's family, who had been so involved in her life, began noticing disturbing changes in her condition. It was clear that something was wrong. Star, once a bubbly and lively toddler, was now appearing more withdrawn, bruised, and frequently distressed. Family members, who had been an integral part of Star's early years, became alarmed as they observed her behavior deteriorating. As early as January 2020, Star's great-grandmother, Anita Smith, noticed marks on the little girl's body. These were not the innocent bumps and scrapes that toddlers often get from exploring the world. They were signs of something more sinister. Anita, who had been a frequent caregiver to Star, immediately became concerned. She was no stranger to the way children should develop physically and emotionally, and these marks were not normal. She wasn't the only one who noticed the bruises. Other relatives, including Frankie's sister, raised concerns about Star's condition as well. It wasn't just the physical injuries that troubled them, it was the change in Star's demeanor. The once cheerful little girl was becoming more withdrawn and seemed afraid at times. Anita wasn't the only one who saw the troubling signs. Frankie's mother, Yvonne, who had been a key part of Star's early life, began to worry as well. As the months passed, Yvonne noticed the bruises and the way Star would cower at certain moments. She couldn't ignore the change in her granddaughter, and it deeply disturbed her. Concerned, Yvonne reached out to social services, urging them to investigate the home and assess Star's safety. At first, social services did take notice. A social worker visited the home in response to the concerns raised by family members. But instead of addressing the root cause of the situation, the assessment was superficial at best. Social workers visited the home, checked the environment, and spoke briefly to the family members involved. They saw Star in the home, and nothing stood out as immediately alarming during the brief visit. Based on their limited assessment, they deemed the case closed. But this first visit was just the beginning of a series of dismissals. The family's concerns continued to grow, but each time, social services closed the case. The bruises on Star's small body weren't enough to trigger further action, and the family's persistent warnings were ignored. Anita's report, Yvonne's concerns, and the quiet but obvious changes in Star's behavior all seemed to be disregarded. Each attempt to protect Star was met with the same response, a closing of the case. This dismissive approach from social services only intensified the family's fear. How could they protect Star if the people who were supposed to ensure her safety were so quick to ignore the evidence right in front of them? The family was left feeling helpless and hopeless, unsure of what steps to take next. They had done everything they could, made calls, sent messages, raised alarms, and yet the system continued to fail them. And most heartbreakingly, it failed Star.
As the months passed in 2020, the early signs of abuse became more apparent. What once seemed like small red flags quickly grew into undeniable concerns. Star's family, who had been so involved in her life, began noticing disturbing changes in her condition. It was clear that something was wrong. Star, once a bubbly and lively toddler, was now appearing more withdrawn, bruised, and frequently distressed. Family members, who had been an integral part of Star's early years, became alarmed as they observed her behavior deteriorating. As early as January 2020, Star's great-grandmother, Anita Smith, noticed marks on the little girl's body. These were not the innocent bumps and scrapes that toddlers often get from exploring the world. They were signs of something more sinister. Anita, who had been a frequent caregiver to Star, immediately became concerned. She was no stranger to the way children should develop physically and emotionally, and these marks were not normal. She wasn't the only one who noticed the bruises. Other relatives, including Frankie's sister, raised concerns about Star's condition as well. It wasn't just the physical injuries that troubled them, it was the change in Star's demeanor. The once cheerful little girl was becoming more withdrawn and seemed afraid at times. Anita wasn't the only one who saw the troubling signs. Frankie's mother, Yvonne, who had been a key part of Star's early life, began to worry as well. As the months passed, Yvonne noticed the bruises and the way Star would cower at certain moments. She couldn't ignore the change in her granddaughter, and it deeply disturbed her. Concerned, Yvonne reached out to social services, urging them to investigate the home and assess Star's safety. At first, social services did take notice. A social worker visited the home in response to the concerns raised by family members. But instead of addressing the root cause of the situation, the assessment was superficial at best. Social workers visited the home, checked the environment, and spoke briefly to the family members involved. They saw Star in the home, and nothing stood out as immediately alarming during the brief visit. Based on their limited assessment, they deemed the case closed. But this first visit was just the beginning of a series of dismissals. The family's concerns continued to grow, but each time, social services closed the case. The bruises on Star's small body weren't enough to trigger further action, and the family's persistent warnings were ignored. Anita's report, Yvonne's concerns, and the quiet but obvious changes in Star's behavior all seemed to be disregarded. Each attempt to protect Star was met with the same response, a closing of the case. This dismissive approach from social services only intensified the family's fear. How could they protect Star if the people who were supposed to ensure her safety were so quick to ignore the evidence right in front of them? The family was left feeling helpless and hopeless, unsure of what steps to take next. They had done everything they could, made calls, sent messages, raised alarms, and yet the system continued to fail them. And most heartbreakingly, it failed Star.
Despite multiple reports from concerned relatives, social services failed to intervene meaningfully. Each time the case was closed, the family's frustration deepened. With every closure, the danger to Star grew. What had begun as a series of warning signs escalated into a situation of clear and present danger. The family wasn't just asking for help, they were desperately pleading for the system to take action before it was too late. But time and again, social services dismissed their concerns, telling them that there was no immediate risk to Star's safety. This systemic failure created a situation where Star was left vulnerable in a home where abuse was escalating and the authorities were either unwilling or unable to act. By May 2020, the situation had become more urgent. Star's great-grandmother, Anita, noticed more visible signs of physical harm on Star's body, including bruising that she could not reconcile with the explanations given by Frankie and Savannah. In particular, there were reports of rough handling, with Star appearing physically distressed after interactions with Savannah. These signs were hard to ignore, particularly for a family member who had been so involved in Star's care. Anita knew that something wasn't right. She called social services once again, urging them to take the situation more seriously. Despite the mounting evidence of harm and the heightened urgency, the case was closed once more. But this time, the family wasn't going to let it slide. Anita, frustrated by the lack of action, pressed harder. She begged social services to reassess the situation, asking for another visit. Again, the family was told that no further action was needed. The explanations offered by the adults in the home, Frankie and Savannah, were deemed sufficient, and no deeper investigation into the ongoing concerns was pursued. The system had failed them once again. In June 2020, Star's father, Jordan Hobson, was sent a video clip that left him deeply unsettled. In the footage, Star appeared with bruising on his face that was impossible to explain away. The marks were visible and significant. There was no doubt that they were the result of more than just a minor fall or accident. Jordan immediately contacted social services, urging them to investigate further. The family had become convinced that Star was being harmed, and the medical explanations for the bruises no longer made sense. He demanded that Star be examined by a medical professional, fearing that the injuries were the result of physical abuse rather than an accident. Social services once again took the case seriously enough to conduct a medical examination. Doctors confirmed the bruises, but the explanations provided by Frankie and Savannah were accepted as valid. They claimed that Star had stumbled into a coffee table, a story that seemed plausible enough to the authorities. However, for the family who had witnessed Star's distress and the marks on her body, this explanation rang hollow. The case was closed, and Star was once again left to suffer in a home where abuse was happening but went unchecked. Over the following months, the family continued to raise alarms, but each time the responses from social services were the same. They accepted the explanations offered by the adults in the home without pushing further, without questioning the context or history of the case. They saw Star, they took a brief look at the circumstances, and they moved on. The reports from concerned relatives were viewed as just that, reports, rather than urgent pleas for help. By September 2020, after 5 failed attempts to get social services to take meaningful action, the situation had become critical. It was clear to everyone involved that Star was being subjected to escalating abuse, but the authorities continued to overlook the mounting evidence. What had started as minor concerns had snowballed into a deadly crisis, and the family was left wondering if anyone would ever listen to their pleas. The case of Star Hobson is a tragic reminder of how a broken system can fail those who need help the most. Each closed case, each ignored warning meant that Star's life was in greater danger than anyone had imagined. The failure to act in the face of such obvious harm would eventually have devastating consequences, but by the time authorities stepped in, it was far too late for Star. The delays and failures of the system had allowed an environment of violence and abuse to fester, leaving Star vulnerable in a home where she should have been safe. By June 2020, the environment at home for Star Hobson had grown increasingly dangerous.
Savannah Brockhill's behavior, which had once been controlling and possessive, escalated into violent outbursts that left visible marks on Star's small body. Star, a 16-month-old child, was subjected to the chaos created by Savannah's aggression, and despite the clear signs of abuse, Frankie Smith, her mother, became more isolated from those who could help. The relationship between Frankie and Savannah had grown toxic, and the control that Savannah exerted over Frankie became all-encompassing. Savannah's violent tendencies were no longer subtle. Family members, particularly Star's great-grandmother Anita and her mother Yvonne, noticed the bruises on Star's body during routine visits. What had started as casual concern was now a pressing issue. There were clear signs of physical abuse, bruises on Star's face, arms, and legs, some of which appeared to be caused by forceful handling. The once vibrant, playful child who had danced to music and responded with joy was now quiet and withdrawn. She appeared afraid, often flinching at the slightest touch, a behavior that no toddler should ever exhibit. Despite the mounting evidence, Frankie distanced herself from the family who had once been an integral part of her and Star's life. What had begun as a seemingly supportive relationship with Savannah had evolved into one marked by control and fear. Savannah monitored Frankie's every move, who she talked to, when she talked to them, and what was said. The more time Frankie spent with Savannah, the less time she spent with her family. Savannah had successfully isolated Frankie from her support system, and it wasn't just emotional isolation, it was physical as well. The family was cut off from seeing Star regularly, and any attempts to intervene were met with hostility and defensiveness from Savannah. The tension within the household was palpable. Savannah's jealousy of anyone who attempted to help Frankie, including her own family, had intensified. She had convinced Frankie that the family was the problem, that they were the ones causing trouble, and that she, Savannah, was the one who had her best interests at heart. This toxic manipulation left Frankie vulnerable, unable to see the full extent of the harm Savannah was causing both her and her daughter. Star, meanwhile, became more and more isolated. The visits from family members, once frequent and filled with love, dwindled. Anita, Yvonne, and others were no longer able to see Star on a regular basis. Every time they tried to reach out, Savannah was quick to put up barriers, dismissing their concerns and keeping them at arm's length. The lack of access to Star meant that no one could fully document the extent of her distress or the abuse she was enduring. Those who tried to intervene were met with resistance, and over time, the warnings raised by family members were brushed aside, leaving them helpless as the situation worsened.
As the summer of 2020 progressed, the signs of abuse became even more apparent. Family members who had once been involved in Star's daily care began to notice the subtle changes in her behavior. The once playful, joyful toddler was now increasingly withdrawn, appearing fearful of her surroundings and the people who were supposed to protect her. The physical signs were undeniable, bruises that didn't match the explanations given by Frankie or Savannah, and the emotional toll on Star was clear. It wasn't just the bruises that raised alarm, it was Star's increasing inability to trust, to smile, to respond to the way she once had. Family members saw the once vibrant child becoming increasingly fearful. Star, who had been so quick to warm up to her family, now flinched at the sight of them. The once joyful smile was replaced by wide eyes that seemed to be perpetually filled with fear. Her demeanor had changed drastically, and family members were left to wonder what was happening behind the closed doors of Frankie and Savannah's home. The abuse was no longer just physical, it had become psychological. Star's spirit, once full of life, was being crushed under the weight of the violence and fear that she was living with every day. The psychological effects of the abuse were just as damaging as the physical harm she was enduring. She had stopped showing the exuberance and energy that she once had, and the change in her behavior didn't go unnoticed by those who had loved her from the beginning. In June 2020, a significant moment occurred that would leave family members heartbroken. Star's father, Jordan Hobson, received a video clip from a family member showing Star with clear bruising on her face. The marks were unmistakable, bruises that had not been there before. Jordan immediately took action. He contacted social services and insisted that Star be examined by a doctor, fearing that the injuries were the result of physical abuse. This was a turning point, a moment when the severity of the situation became undeniable for Star's family. They had all noticed the changes in her, but now there was undeniable proof that something was seriously wrong. But once again, social services failed to act. They sent a social worker to the home to investigate, but the result was the same as before. Social services accepted the explanations provided by Frankie and Savannah, that Star had simply stumbled and fallen. The idea that these injuries could be the result of something as simple as an accident seemed far-fetched to the family who had witnessed the changes in Star's behavior and the mounting evidence of abuse. The explanation given by Frankie and Savannah was not questioned, and the case was once again closed. This marked a devastating turning point. Family members, desperate for help, began to document Star's condition, sending photos, videos, and messages to authorities in an attempt to raise awareness. They were met with resistance at every turn, with each attempt to draw attention to the abuse being dismissed or ignored. Despite the clear evidence of physical harm and the visible changes in Star's demeanor, the system failed to take meaningful action. Each case closed, leaving Star vulnerable to further harm. As the family continued to raise their concerns, the signs of abuse grew even more alarming. The bruises were becoming more frequent, and the emotional toll on Star was becoming increasingly evident. The red flags were no longer subtle, they were glaring. Yet every attempt to intervene was met with dismissal by social services. The warnings raised by family members were brushed aside as if they were nothing more than misguided concerns. The failure of the system to protect Star, despite the mounting evidence of abuse, was nothing short of heartbreaking. Every time the family tried to take action, they were met with resistance, and each time they were ignored, Star was left vulnerable in a home where the abuse continued to escalate. With each passing day, the system's failure to intervene became a silent accomplice to the violence Star was enduring. As the months wore on, the escalating signs of abuse left family members with one haunting question. How much longer would it take for someone to listen? But by the time the authorities would finally step in, it would be too late for Star. Her damage had already been done, and her life would be tragically cut short by the very people who were meant to protect her. The day Star Hobson was fatally injured began like any other, or at least it seemed that way to those on the outside. But within the walls of the small home in Keighley, West Yorkshire, the atmosphere was charged with tension, and what would unfold on September 22, 2020, was nothing short of horrific. It was a day that would change everything, a day that would take the life of a 16-month-old girl whose only crime was being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Star's mother, Frankie Smith, and her partner, Savannah Brockhill, had been living together in a volatile and increasingly violent environment. By this time, Savannah's jealousy, possessiveness, and aggression were well documented, but Frankie, emotionally and psychologically manipulated, continued to remain on the relationship. This day, like so many others, was marked by intense tension between the two women. The conflict began over something trivial, a torn concert ticket. To an outsider, it might have seemed like a small issue, a misunderstanding that could easily have been resolved. But in the home where abuse had already been escalating, it was a spark waiting to ignite a violent confrontation. Savannah, already on edge, became enraged by the incident. Her frustration, anger, and lack of control all culminated in a violent outburst towards Star. Star, innocent and unaware of the conflict around her, had become the target of Savannah's fury. The attack was swift and brutal, a powerful punch, a kick, or a violent blow that struck Star in the abdomen. The impact was devastating. Star's fragile body, still growing and unprepared for such force, was struck with the kind of violence that ruptured her internal organs, causing massive damage. The force required to inflict such injury is unimaginable, akin to the impact of a road traffic collision. But this was not an accident. It was a deliberate act of violence. Star, unable to comprehend the cause of her pain, screamed out in distress, her tiny body racked with the effects of the internal trauma she had just experienced. Her cries, undoubtedly filled with confusion and terror, echoed through the home. But instead of rushing to her aid, Frankie, still caught in the psychological grip of her toxic relationship with Savannah, did not act immediately. Instead of scooping Star into her arms, seeking comfort for her child, she hesitated. The brutal injury that Star sustained was catastrophic, but instead of the urgent, instinctive response any mother would typically have in such a situation, there was only a chilling delay. Savannah, likely aware of the severity of what had just transpired, did not offer any help either. There was no attempt to comfort Star, no immediate concern for the well-being of the little girl who had just been violently attacked. Instead, she focused on Savannah, controlling the situation as she had so many times before. The horror of the moment, the trauma that Star had just endured, was met with cold indifference. In what should have been the most urgent moment of any parent's life, Frankie's response was, instead, a shocking delay. The first thing any reasonable person would do in a moment like this is pick up the phone and call emergency services. A child has been seriously injured. Immediate action is required. But instead of calling for help, Frankie did something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. In the moments following the violent attack, instead of dialing 999 to summon paramedics to her daughter's side, she searched online. Frankie, in a state of confusion and shock, opened her phone and typed in the search query, "shock and babies." She searched for information, perhaps trying to find answers, perhaps trying to convince herself that Star's condition was not as severe as it truly was. But whatever the reason for the delay, the result was catastrophic. Frankie did not call for help immediately. She did not act as any mother would when faced with the horror of seeing her child in severe distress. Instead, she searched online, unsure and paralyzed by the situation unfolding before her. This delay was nothing short of devastating. In that moment, each second that ticked by without intervention made the difference between life and death. The injury that Star had sustained was catastrophic. The damage to her internal organs meant that Star's life was hanging by a thread, and those precious moments could have been the difference between saving her life or losing her forever. But the delay in calling for help meant that the chance to save Star was slipping away. In total, Frankie waited for over 11 minutes before she finally made the decision to call emergency services. The clock was ticking as she frantically tried to find some reassurance online, but with each passing second, Star's condition worsened. The physical trauma that she had suffered could not be undone by a simple search for answers. As time wore on, the damage to her body became more and more severe. When Frankie finally made the call to 999, the paramedics were dispatched to the home, but by the time they arrived, Star was unresponsive. The little girl who had once been so full of life and energy was now fighting for her life. The delay had cost her the chance for immediate medical intervention, and by the time the paramedics arrived, it was already too late. Star was rushed to the hospital where doctors fought to save her. They worked tirelessly to try and stabilize her, but the damage had been done. Star's injuries were so severe, so catastrophic, that there was little they could do. The internal bleeding, the ruptured organs, the broken body, everything pointed to the brutal attack she had endured at the hands of Savannah Brockhill. The medical team worked as fast as they could, but the chances of saving Star's life had long passed. At 4:04 p.m. on September 22, 2020, Star Hobson was pronounced dead. The aftermath of Star's death was marked by a mix of shock, grief, and guilt. Star's family, those who had tried so desperately to intervene, to protect her, to save her, were left in a state of disbelief. How could this have happened? How could a child who had been so loved, so cherished, meet such a tragic end? The system had failed Star at every turn, and now her life was gone. Frankie, left to process the enormity of what had just occurred, would have to live with the weight of the decisions she made in those crucial minutes. The delay in seeking help, the failure to protect her daughter, would haunt her for the rest of her life. It is a tragedy that no one should have to experience. A mother's guilt compounded by the heartbreaking reality that a life was lost because help came too late. Star Hobson's death was not just the result of a brutal act of violence. It was the result of a systemic failure. The failure to intervene when multiple warnings were raised, the failure to protect a vulnerable child, and the failure to act when the signs of abuse were so glaring. All of these factors played a role in her tragic death. September 22, 2020 would be the day that an innocent child's life was taken, and the world would be left to ask, how did this happen? The aftermath of Star Hobson's tragic death on September 22, 2020 sparked an intense and thorough investigation, one that would ultimately reveal the harrowing truth about what had been happening behind closed doors. While the initial circumstances of Star's death were heartbreaking enough, an innocent toddler fatally injured by an adult, it was the evidence uncovered during the investigation that would expose the full extent of the abuse she had endured leading up to her death. From the outset, law enforcement and forensic experts knew they were dealing with a case of violence, far beyond a simple accident. The nature of Star's injuries, coupled with her history of bruising and distress, pointed to deliberate harm. The forensic examination of Star's body revealed multiple older injuries, including fractures to her ribs, tibia, and skull. These injuries were consistent with prolonged abuse, not a one-time accident. The severity of the damage to her body, particularly the fatal rupture of her internal organs, told a chilling story. Star had been subjected to repeated physical violence before her death. The force needed to inflict these injuries was beyond what could be explained by a child simply stumbling or falling. This was a violent, intentional act. At the hospital, doctors who examined Star's body noted the extent of her injuries, confirming that the damage to her internal organs was consistent with a high-impact trauma, comparable to the force seen in road traffic collisions. This was not an isolated incident. The multiple injuries, both old and new, suggested a pattern of abuse that had escalated over time. The brutal force used in the attack on September 22 was a culmination of months of mistreatment, but it was clear that the seeds of violence had been sown long before that fatal day. One of the most significant pieces of evidence uncovered during the investigation came in the form of CCTV footage. Surveillance cameras at a recycling plant in Doncaster captured disturbing footage of Savannah Brockhill physically handling Star with force. The footage, analyzed frame by frame, showed Savannah being aggressive towards Star in a parked car just days before Star's death. The images were undeniable. Savannah was seen striking Star with such force that it was clear the child was in distress. The video footage provided concrete evidence of the aggression that had been building for months. What had been told to authorities as minor incidents and simple accidents was now clearly being exposed as an ongoing pattern of physical abuse. Moreover, city center CCTV footage from Bradford, taken just days before the fatal incident, revealed disturbing images of Frankie dragging Star through the street. Star, clearly unwell and showing signs of weakness, was being pulled along by Frankie, who seemed more concerned with getting from one point to another than tending to her daughter's well-being. The footage painted a clear picture of a child in distress, yet no one intervened at the time. The footage, along with witness testimony, helped investigators piece together the full picture of the abuse Star had suffered, leading to the inevitable conclusion that the abuse was ongoing and escalating. The investigation into Star Hobson's death would uncover a series of digital clues that revealed not just the physical evidence of abuse, but the premeditated nature of the violence that led to her death. Forensic experts delved into the phone records and digital footprints left behind by Frankie Smith and Savannah Brockhill in the critical days leading up to Star's death. The digital evidence was chilling. One of the most damning pieces of evidence was the series of searches conducted by both Frankie and Savannah in the hours leading up to Star's fatal injury. In the critical moments after the attack, while Star was suffering from severe internal injuries, Frankie's first instinct was not to seek immediate help. Instead, she turned to her phone. Frankie, in a state of panic and confusion, searched online for information on shock and babies. These searches revealed an attempt to understand what was happening to Star, but they also demonstrated a staggering delay in calling emergency services. Instead of immediately dialing 999 to get her daughter medical help, Frankie was searching for answers, unsure of the severity of the situation. The search for information lasted for over 11 minutes, a delay that ultimately cost Star her life. But the digital evidence didn't stop there. Savannah's phone history revealed chilling searches that seemed to align perfectly with the timeline of Star's abuse. Among the searches was one that stood out as particularly concerning. Can you die from being winded? This search was made just hours before the fatal attack on Star, and it aligned with the physical trauma Star had sustained. The search indicated that Savannah was well aware of the potential consequences of her violent actions, suggesting premeditation and an understanding of the harm she was about to cause. The search was made shortly before the fatal blow was struck, an indication that Savannah was aware of the severity of the attack and the potential for life-threatening injuries. The combination of Savannah's search for how long someone could survive after being winded and the violent actions witnessed on CCTV painted a clear picture of a deliberate and calculated attack. The forensic evidence matched the digital traces left behind. Star's death was not a tragic accident. It was the result of repeated and escalating violence, planned and executed with chilling precision. The forensic experts confirmed that the injuries sustained by Star, particularly the ruptured abdominal organs, could not have been caused by a simple fall or accident. They were consistent with the kind of violence seen in road traffic accidents or violent assaults. The investigators also discovered that the pattern of abuse had been ongoing for months. Previous reports of bruising, distress, and odd behavior in Star were not isolated incidents, but rather signs of prolonged mistreatment. The fact that Star had been subjected to physical violence and emotional manipulation over an extended period of time was confirmed by digital records, witness testimonies, and forensic evidence. The evidence pointed to a systematic abuse that escalated until it reached the point of no return. It was clear that, despite the attempts to dismiss the family's concerns, the abuse had been building up over time. The family members had noticed the bruises, the withdrawn behavior, and the physical marks on Star's body. They had tried to intervene, to alert the authorities, but their warnings had been ignored. The digital evidence uncovered during the investigation only added weight to their concerns, providing undeniable proof of the abuse that had been taking place behind closed doors. As the investigation continued, it became evident that the tragic death of Star Hobson was the result of a series of failures. Failures on the part of social services, the authorities, and those who were meant to protect her. The physical and digital evidence pieced together the story of a little girl who had been subjected to repeated violence and neglect, all while those who could have intervened failed to act in time. The investigation revealed the horrifying reality of Star's life in the months leading up to her death, providing a clear, unambiguous picture of the abuse she endured. It was a tragedy that could have been prevented had the system acted when the signs were first raised. Star's life was stolen from her, not in a single moment, but over months of escalating violence, and the evidence uncovered during the investigation would ensure that her story would not be forgotten. The court proceedings that followed Star Hobson's tragic death were nothing short of intense. In the months following the investigation, the case finally went to trial, and the details of what had occurred in the Hobson household began to unfold before the eyes of the nation. The courtroom was filled with the weight of the evidence that would ultimately reveal the horrors Star had suffered in the months leading up to her death. The case would expose not only the perpetrator's actions, but also the systematic failures that had allowed the abuse to escalate unchecked. The trial began in the autumn of 2021, and the prosecution presented a damning case against both Savannah Brockhill and Frankie Smith. The courtroom was filled with shocking testimony as forensic experts and medical professionals detailed the severity of Star's injuries. The evidence was clear. Star had been the victim of brutal, sustained abuse. Forensic testimony revealed the extent of Star's injuries, including fractures to her ribs, tibia, and skull, as well as the fatal abdominal injury that had ruptured her internal organs. The cause of death, as determined by the medical examiner, was a violent and deliberate act. The force required to inflict such damage was equivalent to that of a road traffic collision, not an accident as had been suggested by the defense. CCTV footage was one of the most critical pieces of evidence presented during the trial. The footage from a recycling plant in Doncaster captured Savannah Brockhill physically handling Star with force in a parked car just days before Star's death. The footage left no room for doubt. It showed Savannah's aggressive behavior towards Star, who appeared distressed and vulnerable. This visual evidence contradicted any claims that Star's injuries were the result of a simple accident. It was clear that the abuse had been ongoing, and the video footage provided a chilling record of the escalating violence. In addition to the forensic and CCTV evidence, the prosecution also presented digital evidence. Phone records revealed that both Frankie and Savannah had searched for information online in the moments following Star's injury. Frankie's search for "shock and babies" was a critical piece of evidence that showed her delay in calling for emergency assistance. Additionally, Savannah's search for phrases like "can you die from being winded?" or "how long can someone go without sleep?" revealed that both perpetrators were fully aware of the severity of Star's condition. The searches pointed to premeditation, further cementing the argument that the death was not an accident but the result of a violent and deliberate attack. Despite the overwhelming evidence against them, both Savannah Brockhill and Frankie denied any wrongdoing. Savannah Brockhill maintained that Star's death was accidental, claiming that the child had simply fallen. Frankie, in turn, argued that she had done the best she could and that she hadn't been aware of the full extent of Savannah's aggression. Their defenses, however, were weak in the face of the irrefutable evidence presented by the prosecution. The jury deliberated carefully, but it was clear that the truth of what had happened was inescapable. After hearing all the evidence, the jury found Savannah Brockhill guilty of murder. The deliberate nature of the attack, the previous history of abuse, and the damning evidence made her conviction unavoidable. Frankie Smith was found guilty of causing or allowing the death of her daughter. While she was not directly responsible for the fatal blow, her failure to protect Star, despite the mounting warnings and her knowledge of the abuse, made her complicit in her daughter's death. The sentencing of both defendants followed the guilty verdicts and provided some semblance of justice for Star Hobson, though the pain of her loss could never be fully erased. Savannah Brockhill was sentenced to life imprisonment for the murder of Star Hobson. Her life sentence came with a minimum term of 25 years, which meant she would serve at least that long in prison before being eligible for parole. The judge made it clear that the severity of her actions, coupled with the evidence of premeditation and the sustained abuse of Star, warranted the most serious sentence possible. Savannah's violent behavior, marked by jealousy and a desire for control, had culminated in the horrific death of a child, and the court made sure her punishment reflected the gravity of her crime. Frankie Smith, who had been convicted of causing or allowing the death of her daughter, received a lesser sentence. The judge acknowledged that Frankie was a young, vulnerable woman who had been manipulated by Savannah and had failed to protect her child. However, the judge also emphasized that Frankie's failure to act in the face of repeated warnings was unforgivable. She was sentenced to 8 years in prison for her role in Star's death. This sentence was later appealed, and in March 2022, the Court of Appeal increased her sentence to 12 years. The judges felt that the original sentence had been too lenient, given the severity of the case and the responsibility Frankie held in allowing the abuse to continue unchecked. The outcome of the trial was met with mixed emotions from Star's family and the wider community. For the family, it was a bittersweet moment. While they found some measure of justice in the guilty verdicts, it did little to erase the pain of losing Star. The trial, though necessary, had also brought to light the painful truth that those who were supposed to protect her had failed her. Star's great-grandmother, Anita, who had desperately tried to intervene on multiple occasions, was left heartbroken by the realization that her warnings had gone unheard. In the end, the trial and sentencing underscored a tragic truth. No matter how much the family tried to help, they could not undo the damage that had already been done. The sentencing of Savannah Brockhill and Frankie Smith brought some justice, but it could never bring Star back. Star Hobson's story and the court proceedings that followed her death served as a painful reminder of the need for better child protection systems, the importance of listening to the voices of concerned family members, and the catastrophic consequences of failing to act when a child's life is at risk. The emotional toll of Star Hobson's death was immense, rippling through her extended family and the community. Star was not just a child to her parents and grandparents. She was the heart of their world, a source of joy and love that was tragically cut short. Her death left an emotional scar that could never be healed, a wound that would linger for the rest of their lives. For Star's family, the grief was compounded by a sense of guilt and helplessness. Family members, particularly her great-grandmother Anita, had tried relentlessly to protect Star. They had raised alarms, sent photos, and made phone calls in an attempt to get help for the little girl they loved so dearly. Each time they were ignored or dismissed by social services, the weight of their powerlessness grew heavier. They had seen the signs, the bruises, the fear in Star's eyes, the change in her demeanor, but their warnings fell on deaf ears. The realization that they could not prevent what happened was unbearable. Anita, Yvonne, and the rest of Star's family were devastated, knowing that their concerns had been ignored and that their efforts to intervene had been futile. For them, Star's death was not only a loss of a beloved family member, but also a heartbreaking reminder of the failure of the system that was supposed to protect her. They mourned not just for Star, but for the child they could have saved, had the authorities acted sooner. In the community, the shock waves of Star's death were felt just as intensely. Her story sparked national outrage as people struggled to comprehend how a child so young could suffer such brutality. Public vigils and memorials were held in her honor, where people gathered to pay their respects and to express their grief over the senseless tragedy. These gatherings were not just an expression of sorrow, but also a call to action. The community, like Star's family, was left grappling with the harsh reality that a child had been failed by those meant to protect her. Star's story became a symbol of the systemic failures in child protection services, as people began to question how such violence could go unnoticed for so long. The public outcry brought much-needed attention to the failures of the child safeguarding system, and many in the community began demanding reforms to ensure that no child would ever be subjected to such neglect and abuse again.
In the wake of Star Hobson's death, significant changes began to take shape within the child protection system.
The tragedy exposed deep flaws in how authorities handled cases of suspected abuse, and it ignited a push for national reforms in child safeguarding practices. The case served as a painful reminder of how vulnerable children can be when the system fails to intervene, and it became a catalyst for change. One of the key reforms that emerged was a focus on improving communication and coordination between agencies involved in child welfare. Prior to Starr's death, there had been a concerning lack of communication between social services, law enforcement, and other relevant agencies. Warnings from family members who had repeatedly raised concerns were not adequately shared between departments, leading to a breakdown in the ability to assess the full extent of the danger Starr faced. The new reforms emphasized the importance of cross-agency collaboration, ensuring that information from concerned family members was given proper weight and not dismissed. Another crucial reform was the establishment of more rigorous assessments in cases of suspected child abuse. Social services were criticized for not properly following up on concerns raised by Starr's family. As a result of the case, there was a renewed focus on ensuring that any allegations of abuse, no matter how small they seemed, were thoroughly investigated. There was also an increased emphasis on the need for child protection professionals to be trained to spot signs of manipulation and coercion, particularly in cases where the child's primary caregiver was in an abusive or controlling relationship. The system also introduced new protocols for handling cases of domestic violence and ensuring that children in such environments were closely monitored. These reforms sought to prevent situations like Starr's, where the system's failure to act had allowed the abuse to escalate unchecked. The goal was simple: to ensure that no child would suffer in silence, and that every possible avenue for intervention would be explored before it was too late. While the changes in the child protection system were a step in the right direction, for Starr's family, no amount of reform could bring her back. Her death was a painful reminder that even with the best systems and reforms in place, vigilance and action from the community and authorities are the only ways to prevent such tragedies. Starr's story will forever be a haunting testament to the need for change and to the importance of listening to those who raise their voices in concern for the safety of children.
Starr Hobson's tragic death serves as a painful reminder that no child should ever be left vulnerable to harm. Her story exposes the cracks in the child protection system, revealing how a child who was clearly suffering could be ignored and failed at every level. Despite numerous warnings from family members, despite the evidence of abuse, the system failed to act in time. Starr's life was taken by those who should have been her protectors, and the consequences are irreversible. This case highlights the need for better communication and accountability within child protection services. It also underscores the importance of listening to those closest to the child, those who see the warning signs of abuse long before it escalates. Families and communities must be empowered to raise their voices, and authorities must be ready to listen and act. Starr's death should not be in vain. It must push us to demand better safeguarding practices, stronger support systems for vulnerable children, and more thorough investigations into suspected abuse. It should ignite a nationwide conversation about the importance of child protection and the urgency of taking action when a child's safety is at risk. Support child protection initiatives, raise your voice, and make sure that Starr's story sparks the change our society so desperately needs.